That tie is crooked. My father stepped back from the hallway mirror, frowned, adjusted it half an inch to the left, then stepped back again like he was preparing for a presidential debate instead of a dinner in a 4-bedroom house outside Arlington. No, that's worse, Sabrina said without looking up from the kitchen island. The island was covered with appetizers that looked expensive enough to require financing. Tiny smoked salmon cups, imported cheese, crackers arranged in perfect circles. A catering receipt from Crescent Oak Bistro sat near the sink was of a total of just an 83.42 cents highlighted in yellow. My father adjusted the tie again, then once more. Nobody touched the food. Julian notices details, he said. Sabrina laughed. Dad, Julian notices results. That's why he's coming here in the first place. There it was. The reason we were all participating in this family theater production. Julian Thorne, former Navy SEAL commander, current CEO of Black Ridge Strategic Systems, corporate legend, defense industry celebrity. According to Sabrina, the man had personally requested this dinner after her latest public relations campaign boosted the company's reputation following a difficult congressional audit. According to Sabrina, this was basically her victory party. According to Sabrina, we should all be grateful. I still can't believe he chose our house, she said, rearranging olives that were already perfectly arranged. Out of everyone at headquarters, my father smiled proudly. That's what happens when people recognize excellence. I sat in an armchair near the living room window, holding a mug of black coffee. Nobody asked my opinion, nobody ever did. I wore a sweater, dark jeans, and the expression of someone waiting for a flight delay announcement. Comfortable, invisible, my father finally noticed me. Not because he wanted to, because he accidentally looked in my direction. His smile disappeared immediately. Naomi, yeah? When Mr. Thorne gets here, let's keep things professional. I nodded. Okay, I mean it. I heard you. He folded his arms. No military bureaucracy stories, Sabrina snorted. Oh, please. Don't scare her. I'm serious, Dad said. Then he looked directly at me. The last thing we need is a conversation about paperwork and regulations. I took another sip of coffee. The irony nearly made me laugh. Instead, I nodded again. Got it. My father seemed relieved, as if he had just prevented a major crisis. The funny thing was that he genuinely believed he understood what I did for a living. To him, I worked somewhere inside a military office building. A desk, a computer, forms, meetings. Nothing impressive, nothing worth discussing. After years of trying to explain my career, I'd eventually stopped. People only hear what they want to hear, especially family. Sabrina carried a serving tray toward the dining room. You know what I love about Julian, she said. I could already tell this was going to be painful. She continued anyway. Real leadership. Dad nodded immediately. Exactly. Not titles, she said. Results, Dad replied. The synchronization was impressive. If they ever started a podcast together, scientists would probably study it. Sabrina set down the tray and checked her reflection in the glass cabinet. Looks to his story, Navy SEAL. Combat deployments. Built $1 billion company. She glanced at me, and he didn't spend his life hiding behind paperwork. There it was, not a direct insult. Those were never Sabrina's style. She preferred precision-guided comments. Small enough to deny, sharp enough to land. I looked at my coffee. Sounds impressive. It is impressive, she corrected. My father smiled again. The proud smile. The smile he usually reserved for her. The smile that said someone had validated his worldview. A notification appeared on Sabrina's phone. She checked it instantly. Oh my God. What? Dad asked. He confirmed. Her face lit up. His driver just left headquarters. Dad actually straightened his posture. I wish I were exaggerating. The man stood taller because another man was driving toward his house. That's the effect heroes have on some people. Or maybe idols. Sometimes the difference is smaller than people think. The next 30 minutes turned into a strange competition between anxiety and vanity. Dad polished glasses that were already clean. Sabrina repositioned decorations nobody would notice. I quietly watched the performance while finishing my coffee. At one point, Dad checked the dining room temperature using a digital thermostat, then checked it again 7 minutes later, then once more. 72 degrees. The temperature had not changed. Neither had his concern. Finally, he walked over and stood beside my chair. For a second, I thought he might ask how work was going. Maybe ask where I'd been last month. Maybe ask why I looked tired. Instead, he said, "Please don't make tonight awkward." I looked up. What exactly would make it awkward? You know. No, I don't. He sighed. The military stuff. I almost smiled. Almost. Because if my father knew what was actually sitting in his living room drinking coffee, he would have been terrified of the answer. Not because I was important, not because of rank. Because reality is usually much larger than the stories people tell themselves. The front window reflected all three of us. Sabrina adjusting decorations, Dad checking his tie again, me sitting quietly in the corner, three people in the same house. Three completely different worlds, and none of them understood the others. A pair of headlights turned into the driveway. Everything stopped. Dad froze. Sabrina grabbed a tray. The house suddenly became silent. For the first time all evening, nobody had anything to say. The black SUV rolled to a stop outside. The man my father admired more than anyone in the world had just arrived. And neither of them had the slightest idea that this dinner was about to become something very different from what they expected. Have you ever been treated like the least important person in the room, only to discover everyone was judging the wrong things? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about dignity, truth, and unexpected justice, remember our new stories premiere every day at 8:30 a.m. ET and 1:30 p.m. ET. Join us for both and make this channel part of your daily routine. I set my empty coffee mug on the side table and watched my father straighten a picture frame that wasn't crooked. The SUV sat in the driveway. Nobody moved toward the door yet. Dad was taking one final lap around the room, like an air traffic controller preparing for a celebrity landing. Sabrina checked her lipstick in the reflection of the microwave. I sat back and let them have their moment. People usually imagine disrespect as something loud. Most of the time, it isn't. Most of the time, it's years of conversations that never happen. Questions never asked. Accomplishments nobody cares enough to understand. My father knew the title on my paperwork, Major Naomi Prescott, United States Army. That was where curiosity ended. As far as he was concerned, I worked somewhere behind a government-issued desk, pushing forms from one stack to another. The truth sounded boring if you explained it badly. And I had learned a long time ago that explaining things to people determined not to listen was a waste of oxygen. Especially family. The funny part was that I actually did spend plenty of time behind a desk, a very secure desk, inside very secure buildings. Buildings where nobody cared about medals, speeches, or inspirational posters. People cared about outcomes. A helicopter either arrived or it didn't. An extraction either succeeded or it didn't. A team either came home or somebody ended up making phone calls to families. Simple. Real. My job inside JSOC oversight wasn't glamorous. Nobody made movies about authorization reviews. Nobody wrote books about operational audits. Nobody put challenge coins on display cases for people who reviewed emergency extraction requests at 2 in the morning. And that was fine with me. The best days in my career were usually the days nobody ever heard about, because silence often meant everyone survived. A burst of laughter came from the kitchen. Sabrina was telling another story about herself. Some things never change. Julian loved the messaging strategy, she said. Dad looked impressed. What did he say exactly? She smiled. He said it helped reposition the company. Dad nodded as if she had negotiated world peace. I wasn't judging. Every profession matters. Public relations matters. Corporate leadership matters. The problem starts when people believe their profession is the only one that matters. That's where arrogance sneaks in, quietly. I glanced toward the front door. For reasons I couldn't explain, a strange feeling had settled into my stomach. Not fear, not anxiety. Something older, something familiar. The sensation reminded me of a radio headset pressing against my ear after too many hours. A memory trying to wake up. 8 years earlier, I had been sitting inside a dim operations center staring at 3 monitors and a tactical map that looked worse every minute. The Korengal Valley. Even now, the name carried weight. Anybody who spent enough time around military operations knew it. The terrain was unforgiving. The mountains didn't care how experienced you were. They didn't care how brave you were. They certainly didn't care how many medals somebody wore. That night had started like dozens of others. Routine. Predictable. Then everything fell apart. A reconnaissance team had been compromised. Enemy positions appeared where intelligence said they shouldn't exist. Extraction routes closed one after another. Communications became fragmented. The kind of situation that makes every decision expensive. I still remembered staring at a casualty projection estimate on my screen. The number wasn't large. 3, maybe 4. But numbers look different when you know they're attached to names. The radio traffic became increasingly chaotic. different voices, different units, different requests. Then I heard him, the commander. Calm at first, professional, focused, the kind of voice people trust, until the situation got worse. Then worse again, then impossible. I remember hearing the change. Most people think panic sounds dramatic. It doesn't. Real panic sounds small. A slight hesitation, a repeated question, a pause that shouldn't exist. A man trying to solve 10 problems while his brain locks onto the 11th. I never knew his face, never saw a photograph, never knew his family. Just a voice buried beneath static and gunfire. The team was trapped. The extraction bird couldn't approach from the original route. Wind conditions were creating dangerous downdrafts near the ridgeline. Fuel calculations were getting ugly. Everybody in the operations center understood the situation. Nobody liked the options. That's when bureaucracy entered the room, because bureaucracy always enters the room eventually. Protocols, authorization chains, approval requirements, risk assessments. Normally, those rules exist for good reasons. Normally, that night wasn't normal. I remember looking at a clock. I remember looking at projected casualty reports. I remember realizing that waiting for every signature would cost lives. So I made a decision, one decision, a very expensive one. I pushed an authorization package through without the approvals that were technically required. Then I manually redirected extraction assets. Then I got on the radio. I can still hear my own voice. Steady, controlled. Giving instructions I wasn't supposed to be giving. Breaking rules I wasn't supposed to break. The commander followed every word. The helicopter pilot followed every word. Everybody followed every word because nobody had better other options. 27 minutes later, the team was airborne, alive, every one of them. The relief lasted about 6 hours. Then came the investigation. Paperwork moves slower than bullets, but eventually it arrives. The official review didn't care about outcomes. It cared about procedure, and procedure had been violated. I accepted responsibility. The file disappeared into a classified archive. My career survived, barely. The commander kept his reputation. His men went home. That was enough. Or at least that's what I told myself. The doorbell finally rang. The sound snapped me back into the dining room. Dad practically jumped. Sabrina grabbed her tray. Everybody suddenly became very interested in standing up straight. I looked toward the front entrance as my father hurried across the hardwood floor. For some reason, the memory of that voice stayed with me. 8 years had passed, thousands of conversations, hundreds of operations, yet a small part of me could still hear static crackling through a headset in the dark. And as the lock clicked open, I found myself wondering why that old memory had chosen tonight of all nights to come back. My father reached the door before the second chime had a chance to ring. The enthusiasm was almost athletic. He opened it with both hands, smiling so hard I thought he might pull a muscle. "Julian!" A tall man stepped inside. The first thing I noticed wasn't his height. It was the way he scanned the room. Fast, automatic. The kind of habit people carry after spending too many years entering places where mistakes had consequences. His eyes touched every doorway, every window, every person. Then the scan disappeared. The CEO smile came on, professional, polished, controlled. Julian Thorne shook my father's hand. "Good to see you, Harrison. The honor is ours." Dad practically glowed. Behind him, Sabrina moved into position with timing that would have impressed an NFL offensive coordinator. Her smile appeared exactly on cue. "Julian, welcome." "Thank you, Sabrina." She lightly touched his arm. "Everyone at headquarters is still talking about the audit recovery campaign." Julian smiled politely. It was good work. That was all it took. If someone had handed Sabrina an Academy Award, she couldn't have looked happier. The house suddenly belonged to her. Every conversation became her stage. Every compliment became a trophy. Every sentence somehow circled back to her achievements. I stayed where I was. Nobody seemed bothered by that arrangement. Dad guided Julian into the living room. "The catering just arrived from Crescent Oak. Smells great. We wanted everything perfect." Julian gave a small nod. "That's kind of you." His voice matched the image, confident. But something felt off. Not wrong, just tired. The magazines always described him as larger than life, a warrior, a visionary, a leader. The kind of man people build conference speeches around. Yet standing 10 feet away, he looked less like a legend, and more like someone carrying a backpack nobody else could see. It showed up in his eyes, briefly, then vanished. Dad didn't notice. Sabrina definitely didn't notice. People rarely see things that don't fit the story they've already decided to believe. "Come meet the family," Dad said. Julian followed him farther into the room. I stood up. Dad gestured toward Sabrina first. You already know my daughter Sabrina. The famous PR mastermind, Julian said. Sabrina laughed. I wouldn't go that far. She absolutely would have gone that far. Julian smiled politely, then Dad pointed at me. And that's my other daughter, Naomi. The pause lasted half a second. She does some administrative filing for the army. There it was. My entire career summarized in 7 words, administrative filing. I kept my expression neutral. Julian gave me a polite nod. Nice to meet you. You too. His attention shifted almost immediately. Not rude. Just distracted. 100 introductions probably looked exactly like this every month. I wasn't offended. Honestly, it was kind of refreshing. For once, someone wasn't pretending to know who I was. Dinner was ready shortly afterward. The dining room looked like a furniture catalog designed by people with trust funds. Crystal glasses, imported serving trays, candles nobody intended to light. A centerpiece that probably cost more than my first used car. Everyone found their seats. Dad sat across from Julian. Sabrina strategically positioned herself beside him. I ended up near the far corner of the table, exactly where everyone expected me to be. The conversation started normally enough. Business, market trends, government contracts, industry forecasts. Then Dad started worshipping. There really wasn't a better word for it. You know what I've always admired about Julian, he said. Nobody had asked. Dad continued anyway. Leadership under pressure. Julian took a sip of water. Harrison, no, really. Dad pointed his fork for emphasis. Most people freeze when things go wrong. Julian doesn't. A strange expression crossed Julian's face. Gone almost immediately, Sabrina jumped in. That's why the company trusts him. Dad nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. The two of them were like synchronized swimmers. Only with more networking. Julian politely redirected the conversation toward company growth. Dad redirected it right back. Then came the military stories. Those were apparently unavoidable. I've read everything I could find about your deployments, Dad said. Julian looked uncomfortable. Most of that stuff is exaggerated. Dad laughed. Not from what I've heard. The stories are legendary. There was that word again, legend. People love legends. Legends are simple, human beings aren't. Julian stared briefly at his plate. For the first time all evening, he looked like he wanted to be somewhere else. I noticed. Nobody else did. Dad continued. You know, Naomi could learn something from that. There it was. I almost checked my watch. The comparison arrived right on schedule. Julian glanced toward me. Dad kept going. She's smart, don't get me wrong. I appreciated the generosity. She just never had much ambition. I took a bite of roasted chicken. It was actually pretty good. Sabrina nodded. Naomi likes staying behind the scenes, Dad laughed. Way behind the scenes. The irony was working overtime tonight. I chewed slowly, said nothing. Years ago, I would have argued. Years ago, I would have defended myself. Years ago, I still believed evidence changed people's minds. Experience cured me of that. Dad leaned toward Julian. You know the type, safe career, stable desks, no risks. Julian looked uncomfortable again. This time I was certain, not offended, not angry, just tired. As if he'd heard some version of this conversation too many times before. The room settled into an awkward rhythm. Dad praising, Sabrina amplifying, Julian enduring, me observing. Outside, another vehicle passed down the street. Inside, silverware tapped against plates. The smell of rosemary and garlic drifted across the table. Everything looked normal, perfect, even. But the longer I watched Julian Thorne, the more convinced I became that something beneath the surface wasn't matching the legend everyone else saw. And for reasons I couldn't explain yet, that old voice from 8 years ago kept brushing against the edge of my memory every time he spoke. Julian set down his fork and reached for his wine glass. The movement should have ended the conversation. My father refused to let it. You must separate great leaders from everyone else, Dad asked. Nobody answered. That had never stopped him before. The ability to stay calm when everything goes wrong. Julian gave a small, polite smile. Harrison, leadership is usually a team effort. Dad waved the comment away. Sure, but some people are built differently. Here we go again. Sabrina immediately joined the campaign. He's being modest. Julian looked toward his plate. I noticed that now. Every time someone praised him, his eyes drifted downward for half a second. Most people enjoy admiration. He endured it. There was a difference. Dad leaned back in his chair. You know, I was reading that declassified report last year. Julian's hand stopped. Barely. Most people wouldn't have noticed. I did. The Corincle Valley operation. The room felt slightly smaller. Julian took a sip of wine. No response. Dad interpreted silence as encouragement. Big mistake. What an unbelievable situation. Sabrina nodded dramatically. I remember reading about that. No, she didn't. She remembered reading a summary somebody else posted on LinkedIn. Dad continued. Completely surrounded. Julian remained silent. No clear extraction route. Silence. Enemy positions everywhere. Silence. The way you got your men out of there. Dad shook his head in admiration. Flawless execution. That word landed differently. Flawless. For the first time all evening, Julian's jaw tightened. Just slightly. The reaction disappeared so quickly that Sabrina missed it. Dad missed it too. I didn't. People who spend years around operational reviews learn to recognize discomfort. Sometimes it's the only warning before something breaks. Dad kept going. If more leaders handled pressure like that, we'd have a lot fewer problems in this country. Julian slowly lowered his glass. I wouldn't describe that night as flawless. Dad laughed. That's exactly what makes you a great leader. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Sabrina looked toward me. Then came the smile. That smile. The one she used whenever she thought she had found a safe target. You see, Naomi? There it was. I set down my fork. See what? That's real service. Her eyes flicked toward Julian, then back to me, not pushing paper. The temperature at the table changed. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. But something shifted. Dad smiled into his wine glass. Sabrina looked pleased with herself. Julian looked exhausted. I stared at my plate for a second. Not because I was offended. Because something in my memory had just clicked. Coringle. The operation. The timeline. The way Julian reacted every time it came up, pieces started moving. Slowly, quietly, like gears finding their place. Dad launched into another version of the story. The version people tell after reading summaries instead of reports. The helicopter came over the eastern ridge, right? I looked up. My mouth moved before my brain had fully joined the conversation. No, it didn't. The words came out softly. Dad blinked. What? I shrugged. The eastern approach would have been impossible. Silence. Dad frowned. I reached for my water. The downdrafts would have pushed the aircraft into the rock face. Julian's had stopped moving, completely. I continued without thinking much about it. It had to come from the southwest corridor. Sabrina laughed. Here we go. I ignored her. The wind shear was too unstable that night. Julian's eyes locked onto me. For the first time since arriving, he wasn't politely looking at me. He was studying me. Dad chuckled. You weren't there. No. I took a sip of water. I wasn't. The room stayed quiet. Something about Julian's expression had changed. He wasn't smiling anymore. Neither was I. Dad shook his head. You're correcting an actual combat operation based on what exactly? I considered the question. The answer came naturally. The extraction bird was Falcon 6-2. Nobody spoke. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. The information simply existed in my head. Some memories never leave, especially the expensive ones. Dad laughed again. Only this time it sounded forced. Falcon what? 6-2. Julian's wine glass stopped halfway to his mouth, not slowed, stopped. The movement froze completely. A strange feeling crawled through the room. Sabrina looked confused. Dad looked annoyed. Julian looked like someone had just opened a door he thought had been sealed shut years ago. I suddenly became aware of what I had said. Not because it was classified. That wasn't the issue. Because almost nobody outside the operation would know it. The call sign had never appeared in public reports, at least not the versions I'd seen. Dad scoffed. Naomi, honestly. I leaned back. What? You read something online and now you're rewriting military history? Sabrina rolled her eyes. Classic. Neither of them noticed Julian. I couldn't stop looking at him. His face had lost color. Not dramatically, just enough. His eyes never left mine. The room had become strangely quiet. The refrigerator hummed in the background. A car passed somewhere outside. Silverfor sat untouched. Nobody seemed interested in dinner anymore. Julian finally set the wine glass down, carefully. Very carefully, like his hands suddenly required concentration. Then he spoke, not to my father, not to Sabrina, to me. His voice sounded different now, lower, more cautious. How do you know that call sign? The question landed in the center of the table. Nobody moved. Dad looked confused. Sabrina looked confused. I felt something old stirring in the back of my mind. A headset. Static. A voice buried beneath gunfire. 8 years disappeared for a moment. And for the first time all evening, Julian Thorne wasn't looking at me like a stranger. Nobody answered Julian's question. My father looked from him to me and back again, trying to figure out why a simple call sign had suddenly become the most important thing in the room. Sabrina looked annoyed. Julian looked terrified. That was the surprising part. Not confused, not curious, terrified. The difference matters. How do you know that call sign? He asked again. His voice was quieter this time. I sat back in my chair. For a moment, I considered giving him an easy answer. Something vague, something harmless. But the way he was looking at me told me he already knew that wouldn't work. He wasn't asking for information anymore. He was testing a possibility, a very old possibility. My father laughed nervously. Julian, trust me, Naomi reads a lot of military articles. I didn't take my eyes off Julian, he didn't take his eyes off me. The rest of the room felt strangely distant. The dining table, the wine glasses, the expensive centerpiece, all of it seemed less important than whatever was happening between us. Julian slowly shook his head. No. The word came out almost as a whisper. No article would have that. Silence. My father frowned. What exactly is going on? Neither of us answered. Julian leaned forward slightly. The polished CEO was disappearing. The carefully managed public image was disappearing. For the first time all evening, I was looking at the soldier underneath. The man before the interviews, before the magazine covers, before the keynote speeches. A man searching through 8 years of memories. I need you to repeat something for me, he said. The request sounded almost painful. I knew exactly what he wanted, because I suddenly remembered it too. Not the reports, not the investigation, the radio, the voice, his voice, static, gunfire, breathing, the sound of somebody trying very hard not to panic. I remembered every second. Some nights never leave you. Julian swallowed. Please. The room became completely still. Even Sabrina stopped moving. I looked at him for a few seconds. Then I nodded. Not because I wanted to impress anyone. Not because I wanted recognition. Simply because I understood what he was asking. 8 years earlier, a desperate commander had needed proof that somebody on the other end of the radio actually knew what they were doing. So I had given him a clearance verification phrase, a code authorization, not classified anymore, but obscure enough that only 2 people in this room should recognize it. I spoke calmly, exactly the same way I had spoken that night. Authority Delta 7 confirmed. Julian didn't blink. I continued. Emergency extraction override approved. His face lost more color. I remembered the rest. Route revision authorized under contingency protocol Sierra 9. Nobody else at the table understood what they were hearing. Julian did. Every word landed like a hammer. I could see it happening. Memory after memory. Moment after moment. The room around him was disappearing. He wasn't sitting in a dining room anymore. He was back in the mountains. Back in the dark. Back in the worst night of his life. I remembered another line. One I hadn't thought about in years. One that came back with perfect clarity, so I said it. The mountain doesn't care who's in command, Commander. Julian's breathing stopped, not literally, but close. My father stared at me. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Nobody answered him. I continued looking at Julian. 8 years vanished from his eyes. I watched recognition arrive, slowly, completely, irreversibly. I suddenly remembered where I'd heard his voice. Not through speakers at corporate events, not during company interviews, not in promotional videos. Over a damaged military radio while rounds cracked across a mountainside. The realization settled into place, and, judging by his expression, the same thing had happened to him. Julian leaned back in his chair. His hand moved to his mouth, then stopped. The legendary Navy SEAL, the Sulj CEO, the man my father practically worshipped, looked like someone had just punched a hole through reality. Sabrina glanced at Dad. Dad glanced at Sabrina. Neither one had any idea what was happening. Spoke first, barely above a whisper. That's impossible. I shrugged. I suppose it depends on your definition. His eyes widened. That response hit him too. Because it was another thing I'd said that night. Not planned, not dramatic, just something that had slipped out when the situation became ridiculous. Back then, he had asked if an extraction route was even possible. I had answered exactly the same way. I hadn't remembered until now. Apparently neither had he until this moment. Julian slowly lowered his head, then raised it again, looking directly at me, really looking. Not at the quiet daughter in the corner, not at the administrative worker, not at the background character my family had described. At me, the person on the other end of that radio. The person who had stayed awake for nearly 30 hours straight. The person who had gambled her career on a decision nobody else wanted to make. The the person who had refused to let his team die. My father finally lost patience. Would somebody explain what we're talking about? Julian ignored him completely. That may have been the first time anyone had ever ignored Harrison Caldwell in his own dining room. His attention never left me. His voice shook slightly, only slightly. But enough. Naomi. I hadn't heard him say my name before. Not really, not like this. Was it you? The question carried 8 years of weight, 8 years of uncertainty, 8 years of guilt, 8 years of unanswered questions. I thought about lying, not seriously, just for a second. Because I knew what came next if I told the truth. I knew exactly how much would change. Then I looked at the man sitting across from me, the man everybody else saw as a legend, and for the first time all evening, I saw something completely different. Not a hero, not a celebrity, not a CEO. Just a tired man who had been carrying a question for 8 years. So I answered him, quietly, honestly, yes. The word barely left my mouth before Julian Thorne looked like the entire foundation of his world had just shifted beneath his feet. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. My father couldn't tolerate even one of them. His hand slammed onto the dining table hard enough to rattle the silverware. What is this? Every head turned toward him. The spell broke instantly. At least for everyone except Julian. Dad pointed directly at me. Naomi, apologize. I didn't move. He looked genuinely angry now, not confused, not concerned. Angry, the kind of anger people feel when reality starts refusing to follow the script they wrote for it. Apologize right now. Julian still hadn't taken his unnoticed. For what? I asked calmly. Dad had laughed once. A short, irritated sound. For making up military stories. Sabrina immediately joined the attack. Of course she did. The opportunity was too good to waste. Honestly, Naomi. She folded her arms. This is embarrassing. I looked at her. She shook her head dramatically. We finally have an important guest in this house and suddenly, you're pretending to be part of some classified operation. The irony was becoming expensive. Dad pointed toward Julian. Do you have any idea how disrespectful this is? Julian remained completely silent. Dad mistook that silence for agreement. A catastrophic mistake. You're sitting here insulting a decorated combat veteran. Still nothing from Julian. Sabrina jumped in again. I knew this would happen. No, she didn't. But facts had never been a major obstacle in Sabrina's career. She leaned back in her chair. This is exactly why you never talk about your work. I raised an eyebrow. Is it? Yes. She nodded confidently. Because every conversation somehow becomes about you. That one almost made me smile. Almost. Dad looked relieved that someone was finally saying what he wanted to hear. There it is. He pointed at Sabrina. Exactly. Then he turned back toward me. You couldn't stand one evening not being the center of attention. I glanced around the table. The center of attention was currently a former Navy SEAL staring at me like he'd seen a ghost. But sure, let's go with their version. Julian still hasn't spoken. The silence was starting to make Dad uncomfortable. People like certainty. They especially like certainty when they're wrong. Unfortunately, reality doesn't cooperate forever. Dad kept digging. Do you know how hard Sabrina worked for tonight? Sabrina lowered her eyes modestly. The performance deserved a standing ovation, weeks of preparation, hours of practice, perfect execution, if only she used those skills for something less annoying. This dinner matters, Dad continued. It matters to her career. Sabrina nodded. It matters to the company, Dad nodded. It matters to relationships. Another nod. Then both of them looked at me. Apparently I was now responsible for threatening Western civilization. I took a sip of water. Neither of them liked that. People expect a fight when they're trying to start one. Calmness feels rude. Sabrina leaned forward. You know what I think? I had a feeling she was going to tell me regardless. I think you're jealous. There it was. The emergencies explanation people use when they can't understand someone. Jealous. A classic simple. Convenient. Wrong. Jealous of what? I asked. She laughed. The attention. Dad immediately supported the theory. Exactly. Julian closed his eyes briefly. Just for a second. The expression looked familiar. Like a man listening to a meeting that should have ended 20 minutes ago. Neither of them noticed. They were too busy congratulating themselves. Sabrina pointed toward Julian. People spend their entire lives accomplishing what he's accomplished. Julian slowly opened his eyes, still silent. And then there's you. The words hung there. Ugly, confident, careless. I watched her for a moment, not angry, not hurt. Mostly curious how certain someone could be while standing directly in front of the truth. My father leaned back. The prosecutor had rested his case. Unfortunately for him, he hadn't noticed the jury. Julian's face had changed. The color hadn't returned. The exhaustion I'd noticed earlier was gone too. Something else had replaced it. Something much heavier. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking through me, past the dining room, past the house. Back to a mountainside 8 years earlier, the realization seemed to be unfolding piece by piece, slowly, painfully. I recognized the expression. I'd seen it during after-action reviews. People replaying decisions, replaying mistakes, replaying moments they wish they could take back. My father mistook the look entirely. See, he pointed toward Julian. Look at him. That was brave, very brave, and now you've upset him. I nearly laughed. The man had absolutely no idea what was happening. None, zero, not even close. Sabrina sighed dramatically. Naomi, just apologize. I didn't answer. Come on. Nothing. This isn't about winning. Still nothing. That part was accidentally funny. Because nobody at the table understood that the contest had ended several minutes ago. They were still arguing about the scoreboard. The game itself was over. Dad's patience finally snapped. His voice rose. Say you're sorry. The command echoed through the dining room. I looked at him. Then I looked at Sabrina. Then I looked at Julian. And I stayed exactly where I was. Because for the first time all evening, my opinion didn't matter. My explanation didn't matter. My defense didn't matter. The truth had already entered the room. Now the only question left was what Julian Thorne intended to do with it. I settled back in my chair and folded my hands in my lap. The movement seemed to confuse my father. Probably because it wasn't the reaction he expected. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't arguing. I wasn't trying to convince anyone. I was waiting. Across the table, Julian lowered his gaze toward the untouched wine glass in front of him. His jaw tightened. One hand slowly closed into a fist. Then tighter still. And for the first time that evening, I found myself wondering whether the legendary commander my father worshipped was about to behave like a CEO. Or like the soldier who had once believed he was going to die on a mountain far from home. Julian's fist tightened one final time. Then it came down. The impact cracked across the dining room like a gunshot. Crystal rattled. Silverware jumped. One of the wine glasses tipped sideways and spilled red wine across the white tablecloth. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Shut your mouth, Harrison! The roar hit the room so hard that my father physically jerked backward in his chair. For a second, he looked less like a corporate executive and more like a schoolboy caught doing something stupid. Sabrina gasped. Actually gasped. I didn't think I'd ever heard that sound come out of her before. Julian stood up, fast. The chair legs scraped violently against the hardwood floor. Nobody spoke. My father stared at him, confused, terrified, lost. The transformation was impossible to miss. The polished CEO was gone. The public speaker was gone. The industry icon was gone. Standing in front of us was somebody else entirely. A man carrying 8 years of guilt. A man who was finally too tired to carry it any longer. Harrison, Julian said. His voice was lower now, still shaking, still dangerous. You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Dad blinked. Julian, I was only... No. The single word shut him down instantly. Julian pointed toward me. Not theatrically, like somebody identifying a fact. Do you know who she is? My father looked at me, then back at him. No. The answer slipped out before he could stop it. The room went silent again. Julian laughed once. There wasn't any humor in it, just pain. That's the first honest thing you've said all night. Sabrina's face had turned pale. Dad, neither man heard her. Julian's eyes never left my father. You worship a story. Another step forward, you built an entire image of me in your head. Another step. And somehow you never bothered learning the truth about your own daughter. My father opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time in my life, Harrison's Caldwell had no speech prepared. No argument, no explanation. Nothing. Julian turned toward me. The anger disappeared, not completely, but enough. Something else replaced it. Something heavier. His shoulders dropped. The fight went out of him, and suddenly he looked older. Not by years, by burdens. The room watched in complete silence as he took one slow step toward my side of the table. Then another, then another. Nobody understood what was happening, except him and me. Julian stopped beside my chair. His eyes were red. I hadn't noticed that before. Maybe they always had been. Maybe I was only seeing it now. He swallowed hard, twice. Then he did something that would have sounded ridiculous if someone had described it to me an hour earlier. He lowered himself onto both knees. Right there, On the dining room rug. The sound that escaped Sabrina was somewhere between a gasp and a cry. My father looked physically ill, because the man he admired more than anyone else in the world had just knelt in front of the daughter he spent years dismissing. Julian bowed his head. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. The silence hurt more than any speech could have. Finally, words came. Uneven, human. I thought we were dead. Nobody moved, nobody interrupted. I thought every one of my men was going to die up there. His eyes lifted toward me. The shame inside them was impossible to fake. I froze. The confession hung in the air. My father stared. Sabrina stared. Neither one seemed capable of processing what they were hearing. Julian continued. I wasn't supposed to freeze. A bitter laugh escaped him. I was the commander. He looked down at the floor. I was the experienced one. Another pause. The leader. His voice cracked. But I froze. The words cost him something. I could hear it. People imagine guilt gets lighter with time. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it grows roots. Julian rubbed his eyes. For a moment, he looked exhausted beyond description. Everything was collapsing. He shook his head. The extraction route failed. His breathing became uneven. Communications were breaking apart. Another shake of his head. I couldn't think. My father looked like someone had unplugged his understanding of reality. The legendary story he'd repeated for years was unraveling in front of him. Julian pointed toward me. His hand trembled. Then she came on the radio. Nobody spoke, just a voice. His eyes met mine again. A calm voice. I remembered, so did he, the mountains, the static, the gunfire, the fear, the endless stream of decisions. Julian's voice dropped almost to a whisper. She told me exactly what to do. A tear rolled down his face. He didn't wipe it away. I followed every instruction. Another tear followed. I trusted a stranger I'd never met because she was the only person left who sounded like she knew what she was doing. The room felt frozen. Julian laughed bitterly. The funny part? Nobody answered. She wasn't even supposed to be making those decisions. His eyes closed. She broke protocol. Another pause. She broke rules. Another. She risked her career. Then he looked directly at my father. And she saved every man under my command. The words landed harder than the fist had. My father's face collapsed. Sabrina covered her mouth. Julian lowered his head again. They gave me a medal. The sentence sounded ugly. Not proud. Ugly. I accepted it. His voice shook. They called me a hero. Another shake of his head. I let them. The guilt was pouring out now. Years of it. I let everyone believe the story. His shoulders trembled. And while people were congratulating me, he looked at me. They buried her career. The room went completely silent. Not awkward silence. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind of silence that only arrives after the truth finally enters the room. Julian's eyes filled again. For a moment he couldn't continue. Then he forced himself to. I searched for you. My father blinked. What? Julian never looked away from me. I searched for 8 years. His voice broke. Personnel records. Another breath. Transfers. Another. Classified requests I wasn't supposed to make. A faint, miserable smile appeared. I could never find you. The smile disappeared. I wanted to tell you thank you. Another tear. I wanted to tell you I was sorry. His head lowered completely. The great Julian Thorne, the legend, the CEO, the decorated warrior, kneeling on a dining room rug, broken by gratitude, broken by guilt, and finally honest. I don't deserve forgiveness. His voice barely carried across the room. I know that. Another pause. But I've carried this every day for 8 years. The room waited. So did he. Then Julian Thorne bowed his head completely and asked the question he had apparently been carrying across nearly a decade. Naomi, his voice cracked last time. Can you ever forgive me? The question stayed in the room long after Julian stopped speaking. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. Nobody knew how. My father looked like he was struggling to breathe. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. The way people do when every assumption they've built their lives around suddenly collapses at once. His chest rose too fast. His hands trembled. The confident man who had spent the entire evening explaining success to everyone else looked completely lost. Across the table, Sabrina was crying, quietly at first, then not so quietly. Mascara had started running down one cheek. She didn't seem to notice. For the first time in her life, she wasn't managing the image. She was trapped inside reality, and reality wasn't cooperating. The strange thing was that I didn't enjoy any of it. I thought I might. Years earlier, maybe. Not now. Watching people discover they've been wrong isn't as satisfying as movies make it look. Mostly it's sad. Especially when they're your family. Julian remained on his knees, waiting, not demanding forgiveness, not expecting it, just waiting. I looked around the dining room. The spilled wine had reached the edge of the tablecloth. One of the candles had tipped sideways. The expensive centerpiece Sabrina spent 40 minutes adjusting now looked completely ridiculous. A few hours earlier, this room had been built around appearances. Now appearances had lost. Truth usually does that, slowly. Then all at once, I stood up. The movement made everyone look at me. My father immediately lowered his eyes. That hurt more than any argument ever could. Because for the first time in my life, Harrison Caldwell wasn't looking at me with disappointment. He was looking at me with regret. And regret arrives far too late to prevent damage. I walked around the table. Nobody spoke. The hardwood floor creaked beneath my shoes. Julian remained exactly where he was. I stopped in front of him. For 8 years he had carried guilt. For 8 years I had carried silence. Neither one had been particularly useful. I looked down at him. Then I smiled slightly. Not because the situation was funny, because something finally felt finished. You brought your men home, Julian. The room stays silent. That's all the payment I ever needed. His eyes closed. For a moment, he looked like someone had finally set down a weight he wasn't strong enough to carry anymore. I extended my hand. Stand up. Julian stared at it, then at me, then back at my hand. The emotion on his face was difficult to describe. Relief, disbelief, gratitude. Probably all three. He took my hand. I helped him to his feet. The gesture felt strangely ordinary, which was exactly why it mattered. No speeches. No dramatic music, no heroic pose. Just two people standing in a dining room after telling the truth. Julian wiped his eyes. I'm sorry. I know. I should have found you. Maybe. I should have said something years ago. I nodded. Probably. A weak laugh escaped him. For the first time all evening, it sounded human. Not corporate, not rehearsed. Human. Then he surprised me again. You deserved better. I thought about that for a second. Then I shook my head. No. He looked confused. I continued. I deserved honesty. Another silence settled over the room. Smaller this time, softer honesty. That was always the missing piece. Not medals, not recognition, not titles, just honesty. I finally turned toward my father. The hardest part wasn't exposing the truth. The hardest part was seeing what came after. Harrison Caldwell looked 20 years older than he had at dinner. His eyes were red. His tie was crooked again. Ironically, he'd stopped caring. Naomi. His voice cracked. I waited. He swallowed hard. I didn't know. It wasn't an excuse, at least a fact. Just a fact. A painful one. I nodded. I know. Another pause. He looked down, then back up. I should have asked. That one landed. Because he was right. Not asked about classified missions. Not asked about military operations. Just asked. Asked how I was. Asked what mattered to me. Asked enough questions to know his own daughter. Sometimes relationships don't collapse because people are cruel. Sometimes they collapse because people stop being curious. Sabrina wiped her face. She looked smaller somehow. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence was gone. The performance was gone. Only the person remained. And she seemed completely unprepared for that. I thought, she stopped. Tried again. I thought you just didn't care. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was tragically backwards. Most quiet people aren't indifferent. They're exhausted. I cared, I said. She started crying again, real crying this time. Not polished, not controlled, real. Nobody knew what to do with it, including her. I picked up my coat from the chair near the hallway. The same coat I'd brought into the house hours earlier. The same coat I'd planned to leave with. Funny how life works. Everything changes. And sometimes nothing changes at all. My father stood up halfway, as if he wanted to stop me. Then sat back down. He knew better. Some conversations require distance before they can continue. Julian stepped aside, not because I outranked him, not because I had saved him, because respect had finally arrived. Real respect. The kind that doesn't need introductions. The kind that doesn't need applause. The kind that doesn't care who gets credit. I walked toward the front door. Behind me, nobody spoke. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to expose, nothing left to win. I opened the door. Cool air drifted inside. Before stepping out, I looked back one last time. My father sat frozen among the ruins of a belief system he'd spent years defending. Sabrina sat beside him, staring at the table as if seeing it for the first time. Julian stood quietly in the middle of the room. No longer a legend, no longer a myth, just a man. And maybe that was better, because legends are easy to worship. People are harder, people make mistakes, people fail, people carry guilt, people grow. Then I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. The truth had finally entered that house. And the funny thing about truth is that it never needs to announce itself. You simply feel it when it arrives. After I left that house, a lot of people would probably expect me to spend weeks celebrating what happened. Some people might even call it revenge. I never saw it that way. The truth is, the most painful part of that entire evening wasn't being underestimated. It wasn't being mocked. It wasn't even spending years listening to my father describe me as someone with no ambition. The most painful part was realizing that he never really knew me. And that's a lesson much bigger than my family. One thing I've learned over the years is that most people don't judge others by character. They judge them by visible evidence: a job title, a social media profile, a house, a car, a degree hanging on a wall. Those things are easy to see. Character isn't. Character requires effort. Character requires curiosity. Character requires conversations that most people are too busy to have. My father knew what rank was printed on my military records. He knew where I worked. He knew which branch I served in. But he never really knew what I actually did. More importantly, he never cared enough to ask. That's the part that stayed with me, not the insults, the absence of curiosity. I want you to think about something for a moment. How many people in your life do you think you know? Your spouse, your children, your parents, your coworkers, your friends. Now ask yourself a harder question. How many of those people have changed in ways you never noticed because you stopped asking questions years ago? That happens more often than people realize. Relationships rarely break all at once. They usually drift apart slowly. One assumption at a time, one missed conversation at a time, one unanswered question at a time, until eventually you're sitting across from someone you've known for 20 years and suddenly realizing you don't know them at all. I've seen versions of that everywhere. Not just in families, in military units, in offices, in marriages, in friendships. People become comfortable with old versions of other people. Then they stop updating their understanding. That's dangerous. Because human beings are constantly changing. The quiet teenager becomes a leader. The overlooked employee becomes the person holding an entire company together. The child everyone underestimated becomes the adult carrying responsibilities nobody else can see. And yet, people keep treating them like the version they created years ago. I spent a large part of my career around highly accomplished people. Some special operators, some were intelligence analysts, some were pilots, some were people whose names will never appear in books or documentaries. You know what surprised me? The most capable people were rarely the loudest. The strongest people in the room often spoke the least, not because they lacked confidence, because they didn't need attention to prove their value. Meanwhile, some of the loudest people spent every day trying to convince others how important they were. There's a difference, a huge difference. Real confidence doesn't demand recognition. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need constant validation. It simply does the work, then goes home. One of the biggest mistakes we make as human beings is confusing visibility with value. Just because someone is visible doesn't mean they're valuable. And just because someone is quiet doesn't mean they're insignificant. The world teaches us to notice performers. Life teaches us to appreciate contributors. Those aren't always the same people. Sometimes they are. Often they aren't. If there's one lesson I hope people take from my story, it's this. Be curious about the people you love, not once, not 10 years ago. Continuously. Ask questions. Listen carefully. Stay interested. You don't have to understand every detail of someone's career to respect them. You don't have to understand every challenge they're facing to treat them with dignity. But you do need enough humility to admit there are things you don't know. My father spent years assuming he understood me. The tragedy wasn't that he was wrong. The tragedy was that he was certain. Certainty closes. Curiosity opens them. And once those doors close, they can stay closed for a very long time. There are people carrying burdens you'll never see. There are people fighting battles they never talk about. There are people sitting quietly at family dinners while everyone around them assumes they know their entire story. Most of the time, they don't. That's why respect matters. Not because everyone deserves praise. Not because everyone deserves agreement. Because every human being deserves the basic dignity of being seen as more than your assumptions about them. If you remember nothing else from this story, remember this. Before you decide who someone is, ask one more question. Before you judge their choices, listen a little longer. Before you assume they have nothing important to teach you, consider the possibility that you're only seeing a small part of their life. Sometimes the most remarkable person in the room isn't the one everyone is looking at. Sometimes it's the person everyone stopped noticing years ago. The older I get, the more convinced I become that ego is one of the most expensive things a person can carry. The problem is that most people don't recognize it when they're carrying it. They think ego always looks like arrogance. Sometimes it does, but not always. Sometimes ego looks like certainty. Sometimes it looks like pride. Sometimes it looks like refusing to ask questions because you're afraid of what the answers might reveal. When I think back to that dinner, I don't just see one person making mistakes. I see two very different versions of the same problem. My father spent years chasing status. Julian spent years running from guilt. On the surface, those seem like completely different struggles. In reality, both were trapped by stories they told themselves. My father convinced himself that success could be measured by titles, visibility, and influence. The higher someone climbed, the more valuable they became. The more attention they received, the more respect they deserved. That belief shaped almost every decision he made. It shaped how he viewed people. It shaped how he viewed his own children. And eventually, it shaped what he failed to see. Julian's situation was different. The world looked at him and saw a hero, a decorated commander, a successful CEO, a man who had won. But behind that image was someone carrying a secret that never left him. Every award probably reminded him of it. Every interview probably reminded him of it. Every speech about leadership probably reminded him of it. Because deep down, he knew part of the story wasn't true. That's the strange thing about ego. It doesn't only hurt the people around you. Sometimes it traps you inside your own success. Sometimes it forces you to protect an image instead of facing reality. And reality always sends a bill eventually. I've seen this lesson play out in places far beyond my family. I've seen it in military units. I've seen it in corporate offices. I've seen it in marriages. I've seen it between parents and children. A husband refuses to admit he made a mistake because he's afraid of looking weak. A manager ignores good advice because it came from someone junior. A parent keeps giving lectures long after they should have started listening. A friend destroys his relationship because apologizing feels harder than being alone. Different situations. Same problem. Ego. One of the most dangerous phrases in the English language is, "I already know." The moment people believe they already know everything they need to know, growth stops, learning stops, listening stops, and eventually relationships stop too. Some of the smartest people I've ever worked with had a habit that surprised me. They asked questions constantly, not because they were uninformed, because they understood how much they didn't know. The most respected commander I ever worked with used to begin planning meetings with the same sentence. What am I missing? Think about how rare that is. A leader asking for help. A leader inviting correction. A leader making room for information instead of defending an image. That's not weakness, that's maturity. The opposite of ego isn't insecurity. The opposite of ego is curiosity. Curiosity allows you to learn. Curiosity allows you to improve. Curiosity allows you to save relationships before they break. Most importantly, curiosity allows you to see people clearly. If my father had been more curious, that dinner never would have happened. If Julian had found a way to confront his guilt sooner, maybe he wouldn't have carried it for 8 years. Different paths, same lesson. Life gets better when you stop trying to protect your image and start pursuing the truth. That doesn't mean becoming passive. It doesn't mean letting people walk over you. It means being willing to ask difficult questions. It means being willing to hear uncomfortable answers. It means being willing to say something most adults struggle to say, "I might be wrong." Those 4 words have saved more relationships than most people realize. They create space. They create trust. They create understanding. And understanding is usually what people are looking for when they argue, not victory. Understanding. If there's one practical lesson I hope you carry into your own life, it's this. The next time you're absolutely certain about someone's motives, pause for a moment. The next time you're convinced you already understand a situation, ask another question. The next time you're preparing to defend your position, spend a few minutes trying to understand the other person's perspective first. You may discover information that changes everything. Or you may discover something even more valuable. You may discover that being right was never the most important thing. Because at the end of the day, ego wins arguments. Humility builds relationships, and years from now, most people won't remember who won the argument. They'll remember who made them feel heard. There's one question people ask me whenever they hear a story like this. It's usually the same question. Almost word for word. How were you able to forgive him? They're usually talking about Julian. Sometimes they're talking about my father. Occasionally, they're talking about both. And honestly, I understand the question. Because forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood ideas in modern life. A lot of people think forgiveness means pretending something never happened. It doesn't. Some people think forgiveness means allowing someone back into your life exactly as they were before. It doesn't mean that either. Others think forgiveness means excusing bad behavior. Definitely not. Forgiveness is much simpler than most people realize, and much harder. Forgiveness is deciding that the past will no longer control the future. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. When I stood in that dining room and watched Julian kneeling on the floor, I wasn't looking at a famous CEO. I wasn't looking at a decorated military commander. I wasn't looking at a public figure. I was looking at a human being, a flawed one, a guilty one, a deeply imperfect one. Just like the rest of us. For 8 years, he'd carried a burden he couldn't put down. For 8 years, I carried silence that served no purpose anymore. At some point, both of us had to make a choice. Keep carrying it, or put it down. That's what forgiveness really is. Not erasing the weight, setting it down. One of the greatest lies people tell themselves is that holding on to resentment protects them. It usually doesn't. Most of the time, it simply keeps the wound open. I've met people who were angry for 20 years, 30 years, sometimes longer. And the strange thing is that the person they were angry at often moved on long ago. The only person still suffering was them. That's why forgiveness isn't always about the other person. Sometimes it's about reclaiming your own peace. That doesn't mean every relationship can be repaired. Some can't. Trust takes time. Sometimes it never fully returns. Some people apologize too late. Some people never apologize at all. Life isn't always neat. Life isn't always fair. But carrying bitterness forever isn't a strategy. It's a prison sentence. And most of the time, we're the ones holding the key. I also want to talk about another lesson from this story. One that matters just as much. The danger of assumptions. Think about everything that happened. My father assumed he knew who I was. Sabrina assumed she understood my value. Julian assumed he would never find the person who saved his team. Every major mistake in this story started with an assumption. That's worth thinking about. Because assumptions aren't just a problem in dramatic situations. They show up everywhere. We assume we understand our spouse. We assume we understand our children. We assume we understand our coworkers. We assume we understand why someone made a certain decision. Most of the time, we're only seeing a tiny fraction of the full picture. The older I get, the more I realize that humility isn't about thinking less of yourself. It's about recognizing how much you still don't know. And that's a lesson that can improve every part of life, every friendship, every marriage, every family relationship, every career, every conversation. If someone asked me to summarize this entire story in a single sentence, I think it would be this. People are almost always carrying more than you can see. That's true for the successful people, the struggling people, the loud people, the quiet people, everyone. The strongest person in the room may be fighting a battle nobody knows about. The happiest looking person may be carrying grief. The quietest person may be carrying responsibility that would overwhelm everyone else. That's why kindness matters. That's why curiosity matters. That's why respect matters. Not because everyone earns it. Because everyone deserves the chance to be understood before they're judged. And maybe that's the lessons I hope stays with you after this story ends. Look a little deeper. Ask one more question. Listen a little longer. Give people the opportunity to surprise you. Because some of the most important truths in life are hidden behind assumptions. And some of the most remarkable people are hidden behind silence. If this story gave you something to think about, something to discuss with your family, or something to carry into your own life, I'd like to ask one small favor. Take a second to subscribe to the channel. Every story we share is designed to be more than entertainment. We want these stories to start conversations, to challenge assumptions, to remind people that character matters more than appearances, and that dignity matters more than status. Your support helps us continue creating stories that don't just pass the time, but leave something valuable behind. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. Take care of yourself, take care of the people you love, and I'll see you in the next story.